Okay, now we have the confidence, the faith of Abraham being set forth in the text. Now we're going to see the unfolding of another aspect of the covenant. First, the aspect of the land. Verse 7 said to him, I am Yahweh, who brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldees. Ni Adonai Asher Hotzetika Ur Kasdim Latet Ha Et Haaretz Zot Le Roshata. I am Yahweh, brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldeans to give to you this land for inheritance, or to possess it. Again, the feminine ending of the infinitive construct there, Garash, it agrees with land. So the feminine on the end. This is the that which is to be. But then, of course, says, Lord Yahweh, Vama Edah Ki Irashena. Lord, with what? How? How will I know that I will possess it? After all, I'm just wandering through the land. I've been from Shechem to Bethel to Ai to Mamre to Beersheba and back again to the Negev and so forth. But how will I know? And he says to him, all right, we're going to do something really interesting. So starting in verse 9, the unfolding of this covenant ceremony, that is to take these animals, first a 3-year-old, larger animals, and then he works down to the smaller ones. So Kaka, Egel, the eights, and the Isle. And then they are to take these, and he says, you're going to cut them into 2 pieces. You're going to lay them out in a parallel, piecemeal fashion, these multiple animals. Now, again, this covenant ceremony is elucidated by texts from the ancient world, Hittite ritual and other. This outline of a ritual ceremony by which, when treaties were made, say like between the Hittites and the Assyrians, or the Hittites and the Kizilwatnu people, the text that we have, for example, a treaty between nations would have a special ceremony by which the 2 chiefs or kings of the covenanting parties would join together when all of the details of the relationship have been outlined, what we call the stipulations of the covenant have been delineated and agreed upon. Then the 2 leaders would ceremonially walk between the animals, covenanting together. Again, this was just a unique ritual practice. It's interesting that the text simply talks about cutting these animals, dividing them, separating them into 2, but doesn't use the terminology of sacrifice. It's kind of interesting that it doesn't utilize those particular terms, such as zabak, but it outlines a ceremonial practice that was known in the ancient world of Abraham, by which parties would enter. But of course, as we know in the context of this, that after Abraham has gone, and you can imagine he's tired. I mean, it takes work to sacrifice or to butcher in a sacrificial manner. I mean, this is in ancient Near Eastern literature, by the way. These are called sacrifices because they are done on behalf of the gods of the nations also. And embedded in the ancient Near Eastern thought, in this covenant ratification process, as the kings are walking through, there is a promise in this covenant relationship that obligates the gods, who are the observers of the covenant, who give their blessing to this covenant relationship, that if the covenant is broken, it should be done to the king who breaks the covenant as it has been done to these animals. So there's this kind of embedded concept of, if you break the covenant, you'll be broken like these animals. and so the obligation, the ratification of the covenant is a very solemn ceremony in which the honorable leaders of these covenanting partners, nation groups or ethnic groups and so forth, that engage in this procedure, are obligating themselves to faithfulness to the covenant. So, time passes. Abram is tired from doing all this work with the animals. And of course, the birds of prey come upon the animals, as would be typical. So what that kind of does in the text, people ask me, why is this thing about the birds of prey coming down? I said, because it's a real life scene. and you lay out animals, split animals out on the ground, and you see enough vultures around New Orleans and all across the South, anywhere in the U.S. In Israel as well. Vultures are very common. They almost look like eagles when they're flying well above you. But anyhow, so in this promissory covenant relationship, we have a unique aspect, and that is that Abram falls asleep. And God, presence of God, often depicted throughout the Old Testament, like in the wilderness, pillar of fire by day, cloud by day and fire by night. Here, God, in the form of this torch, fiery torch, passes through the split animals in what we call a unilateral, God obligating himself to be faithful. Of course, we know God is always faithful, but here in a very formal way, God demonstrates to Abraham that he is the ultimate promiser, guarantor of the covenant relationship. God is guaranteeing that he will be with and for his people through all circumstances. So the summary then comes forth in verses 17, 18, and following, the reiteration, as he has sacrificed his animals, set them forth. God passes through Hinei, Tanur, Ashan, flaming torch that is going then to, like a flaming torch of fire, passes through, and Asher Avar Bey passes through the Gezerim, those things, these cut animals. And so, summary, Vayom Hahu Harat Adonai. In that, the additional word, very day, in that day, Harat Adonai, Yahweh cut with Abraham a berit, covenant. So literally, Abraham cut the animals, God cuts the covenant. God establishes through this special ceremony his relationship. And he says, reiteration, to your descendants, I will give this land. Those descendants, he says, which will be beyond the numbers of the stars in the heaven. Earlier verses. And I will give this land, and now a delineation of the land, Min Nahar Mitzrayim, from the river of Egypt. And by the way, that's not the Nile. The Nile has a different name in Old Testament nomenclature. You get that over in the book of Exodus, as you had the plagues around the Nile River. But the Nile, the Nahar Mitzrayim is the brook of Egypt, which describes the southwest or southern corner of the land, which is today we know as the Wadi El Arish. Kind of starts in the area of Kadesh Barnea. You know that from the book of Numbers. Kadesh Barnea is where, close to where we have various of the patriarchs traveling through. It's right barely in the modern day borders between Egypt and Israel, down in the southern Negev region. It's just across on the Egyptian side of the border. I only had one opportunity to go there back in 1981, and then again in 82, before Israel gave the Sinai back to Egypt in the Camp David Accord in the days of Menachem Begin and Jimmy Carter. But anyway, so that's the Nahar Mitzrayim, brook of Egypt, the Wadi El Arish, that kind of runs from Kadesh Barnea northwest to the Mediterranean, just south of the Gaza Strip. Today, this is also the border with Israel and Egypt. And it says, then unto Hanahar Hagadol, then more explicitly, Nahar Harat, the great river that is the river of Euphrates. So the land would extend from what is today the modern border of Egypt all the way to the edge of the northern Mesopotamian world. That comes to fruition, by the way. If you read back in both Kings and in Chronicles about the territory that this is fulfilled, is in the reign of Solomon via Davidic conquest and negotiating, that it says that the kingdom of Solomon spread from the river Euphrates down to the Nahar Mitzrayim, the brook of Egypt. And so it would come to pass during the height of the kingdom period under Solomon. So we have this covenant ceremony. Promise of the land is reiterated. Again, this kind of blocks out the text of the beginning. Earlier we talked about the land promise and the promise of descendants that is set forth in this chapter. And then the rest, of course, the chapter goes on to delineate that this is a land that at this point a lot of different people groups are inhabiting. And he goes through this from the Kenites to the Kenizzites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Some of those we know well later on in the text. The Hittites, of course, we have Uriah the Hittite, who's a member of David's army. You're familiar with the land of Canaan, we talked about last time, sometimes used in a very specific sense and sometimes in a broad sense. Amorite is likewise a word that can be used in a narrow or broad sense. Jebusites, of course, were the occupants of Jerusalem, all the way up until the time of the Davidic conquest of Jerusalem. So, but it wants to highlight, chapter 12 we had, it simply said the Canaanites are now in the land, which is a statement, by the way, that historically the Canaanites are established during the Middle Bronze Age in the land, just before the time of, or about the time of Abraham's initial sojourn. So it's a land of many people groups, been the cross-migration route for 2,000 or 3,000 years before Abraham. And this is the way that so many different people groups became part of the land. So, but this is the land that is the promised land that will come to pass beginning in the conquest narratives of Joshua and ultimately fulfilled height of the kingdom era under David and Solomon. So, promise of the covenant, a very special ceremony. God promises his faithfulness. Abraham has become a faithful follower of Yahweh. Hope you have a great week of interacting with biblical text in chapter